Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, August 16, 2023. President Joe Biden celebrates the anniversary of his signing the Inflation Reduction Act into law. It's a law that seeks to promote clean energy and address climate change and reduce healthcare costs. The FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell with an update on the recovery efforts after the wildfires on the Hawaiian island of Maui, including the search for the missing, which ends too often in recovery of their remains. Also, she spoke about aid to the survivors. As the White House confirms that President Biden and First Lady Jill Biden will be traveling to Maui next week. Republican presidential candidate Mike Pence, a former vice president, responds to the latest indictment in Georgia of another candidate, former President Donald Trump, for the first time, saying the Georgia election was not stolen. State Department asked about North Korea's statement on U.S. soldier Travis King, confirming that he crossed the border from South Korea into North Korea and claiming he was escaping inhuman maltreatment and racial discrimination within the U.S. Army. And a preview of Friday's summit with President Biden and the leaders of South Korea and Japan at Camp David U.S. Presidential Retreat in Maryland. We'll hear from the National Security Advisor spokesperson John Kirby. A story from Reuters. U.S. President Joe Biden on Wednesday marks the first anniversary of signing his signature clean energy legislation called the Inflation Reduction Act by leading a campaign to better explain to Americans what exactly it does. The climate-focused bill provides billions of dollars in tax credits to help consumers buy electric vehicles and companies produce renewable energy. As President Biden aims to decarbonize the mighty U.S. power sector, it also helps seniors pay for prescription drugs, expands some elements of Obamacare, and asks wealthy Americans and corporations to pick up the tab. Reuters article continues 12 months after it passed. The law commonly referred to as the IRA, like most major U.S. legislation, has mixed reviews. Meanwhile, many Americans, even those who support President Biden, don't know much about it, according to a Reuters opinion poll. President Biden spoke today at the White House, joined by members of his cabinet and the Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and former House Speaker Democrat Nancy Pelosi. The president talked about the major parts of the law. First, climate and energy.
We're bringing critical supply chains and technologies home for electric vehicle batteries, solar panels, wind turbines, critical minerals. And because the CHIPS and Science Act, we've generated $231 billion in private investment in making semiconductors. $231 billion. A small computer chip the size of the end of your fingertip that affects nearly everything in our lives, from cell phones to automobiles to the most sophisticated weapon systems. You know, we invented these chips. We used to produce these chips. We stopped, and we saw during the pandemic we paid a high price for things that when overseas factories shut down, we paid a big price. But now we're bringing semiconductors home. In 2030, the Inflation Reduction Act is projected to help triple wind power and increase solar power by 8-fold. By 2030, electricity deployed through the U.S. power grid is expected to be powered by 81% clean energy. Hear me? 81% clean energy. Imagine the impact on climate and the air we breathe. The law is going to help meet all of my bold climate goals by cutting carbon pollution in half by 2030. In half by 2030. And between the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're investing more than $50 billion to build up resilience and impacts on climate change. These laws support important priorities, from addressing historic drought along the Colorado River Basin. Remember when I said we had a concern about the Colorado River literally going dry? You all thought I was crazy. I wish I had been, but guess what? I was just out there and looking down in the Grand Canyon, and guess what? It's coming back. But at any rate, we're responding to coastal erosion, sea level rise in the Gulf of Mexico, and helping reduce the effects of extreme heat by investing nearly $1.5 billion to plant trees and expand community parks and forests. Folks, there's a lot more. You've heard a lot today, and I'm going to not go into it all, but this law is helping families save thousands of dollars in energy bills every year through the tax credit and rebates to buy new and efficient electric appliances, weatherize their homes, install heat pumps, rooftop solar. As a consequence of this, it's estimated that the consumer is going to save at least $27 billion in electric bills between now and 2030.
President Biden at the White House on the anniversary of the law called the Inflation Reduction Act. He also highlighted some of the health care provisions.
Because the Inflation Reduction Act, we're talking about life-saving steps to reduce health care costs. It locks in place the lower health care premiums for millions of American families under the Affordable Care Act, saving them an average of $800 a year. And I see my friends in the Congress who saw that, in the Senate and House, saw that make that happen. Plus, we pay more for our prescription drugs than any country, major country in the world. The product made here in the United States, sold in Montreal or Paris or anywhere around the world, is cheaper than it's made here where it's been produced. For years, many of us have been trying to give Medicare the power to negotiate lower drug prices, which will reduce, by the way, the federal deficit at the same time. Because when Medicare doesn't have to pay the high price, guess what? It cuts your taxes. It cuts the amount of money the federal government has to pay. For years, Big Pharma won. Big Pharma blocked us. But not this time. I know I don't look it, but I've been around for 400 years. And I've been fighting pharma on this since 1970s. No, not a joke. This time we finally beat Big Pharma. Medicare finally has the power to negotiate lower prescription drug prices like the Department of Veterans Affairs has had the power. That's not all. You've heard it's already spoken to. Insulin. Companies pay, it costs, by the way, the guy who invented the insulin, he never patented it because he wanted it available for everybody. It never was patented. And guess what? It costs $10 to make, and if you use everything, including packaging, it could be as high as $12.50. Now those companies are charging 30 times that amount. Now seniors on Medicare, and by the way, it should be beyond seniors on Medicare, but I'll come back to that in another time. We're paying as much as $400 a month for insulin, and they're now just paying $35 a month. We're also capping total out-of-pocket expenses for drugs for seniors in Medicare to $2,200 a year, $2,000 a year for even the expensive cancer drugs that could cost as much as $10,000, $12,000, $14,000 a year. Combine all the costs of their drugs by 2025, they'll never have to pay more than a total of $2,000 after 2025.
President Biden at the White House on the anniversary of the signing of the Inflation Reduction Act. He said it was one of the most significant laws ever enacted, taking on the special interests and winning. He says this law is transformative. You can find the full event at our website at cspan.org. The House and Senate are not in Washington for business. They're still on their August break. Senator John Cornyn, Republican from Texas, posting hashtag on this day last year, President Biden signed the Inflation Reduction Act, better known as the Inflation Creation Act. As expected, this bill only hurt hardworking Texans and kept costs high for the things families buy every day. Worse yet, he left future generations to foot the bill. Average gas prices in the Lone Star State are just as high as they were a year ago. Prices for food, rent, and buying a new home have continued to soar. Families across our state are having a harder time making ends meet thanks to Joe Biden's failed policies. That post from Senator John Cornyn. And from Congresswoman Debbie Lesko, Republican from Arizona. The Inflation Reduction Act, she writes, did quite the opposite of what its name would suggest, and American families are continuing to suffer through the Bidenomics cost of living crisis. That's why I'm pleased to be joining Congressman Andy Ogles, Republican from Tennessee, in co-sponsoring H.R. 812 to repeal the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act and take back money allocated by the bill but not yet spent. That post from Congresswoman Debbie Lesko. Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, was a necessary Democratic vote to get the Inflation Reduction Act passed in the Senate with solid Republican opposition. A nonprofit organization called One Nation, aligned with the Senate Republican Leadership Fund Super PAC, has put out an ad criticizing Senator Manchin for that vote.
1 year ago, West Virginia coal jobs were targeted by Washington. Senator Joe Manchin played a pivotal role in writing President Biden's liberal green energy scheme. Now, 100,000 West Virginia jobs are at risk. Senator Manchin did a victory lap. He proudly took credit for passing the job-killing bill. President Biden even gave him the pen. Our West Virginia way of life is under attack. Tell Senator Manchin, change course. Defend our coal jobs, not D.C. liberals' climate policy.
That ad posted by the group One Nation. A story from The Hill. Senator Joe Manchin on Wednesday said he will keep up his battle against the Biden administration and officials who seek to undermine the Inflation Reduction Act as part of their radical climate agenda, his words, on the first anniversary of it being signed into law. In a statement, Senator Manchin lauded the IRA as one of the most historic pieces of legislation passed in decades, especially for middle-class and working-class families. He also hailed its work to reduce the national debt, lower prescription drug prices, and cap the price of insulin for seniors. But he also issued a shot across the bow at the administration as it continues to heap criticism on those he says are playing political games with the law. He writes, with respect to energy security, and contrary to those in the Biden administration who seek to undermine this goal, this law reestablished an all-of-the-above energy policy and empowered the growth of fossil fuels and renewables. That from The Hill. A couple of days ago, President Biden at a fundraiser in Utah was quoted as saying about the Inflation Reduction Act, "I wish I hadn't called it that because it has less to do with reducing inflation than it does to do with dealing with providing for alternatives that generate economic growth." Congressman David Schweikert, Republican from Arizona, responded online, "A stunning admission. As I've said time and again, the Orwellian-named Inflation Reduction Act didn't actually reduce inflation. It kept inflation going. And 60% of clean energy projects in the bill went to foreign companies. That's Bidenomics." Congressman Schweikert included a clip of a speech he gave on the House floor in mid-July.
And then you have the insane policies that this place did over the previous couple years when the left controlled it. You know, when you had a Democrat House, Democrat Senate, Democrat President. Do you remember the Inflation Reduction Act? Insane name. Had nothing to do with reducing inflation. It was spending money. It kept inflation going. But about 2 hours ago, the Wall Street Journal published an analysis of these grants that they're giving away to big industries. Now, they're in the clean energy industries, but they're still really big industries. Well, it turns out the vast majority of the cash this government's giving out from last year's Inflation Reduction Act is going to foreign companies. Yep, our taxpayer dollars that were supposed to help us build a U.S. clean industry or clean energy industry functionally structure. 60% of clean energy projects awarded from the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, are foreign-owned businesses. Yay, policy! So you see we're borrowing $63,000 a second. We're crushing our kids, our grandkids, and many of your own retirements because they're the ones that have to pay this debt back. And we're doing projects funded by last year's legislation that was only supposed to cost about $280 billion only. And then Goldman Sachs comes in and says, nah, the spending on all these grants and these giveaways and this, these supplements function could be $1.2 trillion. CBO comes in and doubles their estimate. And now we find 60% of that money is going to foreign companies. This is not what we were promised. The president, the Democrats promised us this was to create a U.S.-based infrastructure for clean energy, except the vast majority of their money, our money, is now going to foreign companies. Great job, guys.
Congressman David Schweikert, Republican from Arizona, on the House floor on July 20th, a clip that he recently reposted leading up to today's anniversary of President Biden signing into law the Inflation Reduction Act. More reaction from Congress. Congressman Richard Neal, Democrat from Massachusetts, Ways and Means Committee ranking member, tweeting, "Today we celebrate the one-year anniversary of the Inflation Reduction Act. In 1 year, we have created 170,000 good-paying jobs, lowered health care costs, saving families an average of $2,400 on health premiums, lowered energy costs, and made historic investments in clean energy." And Senator Shelley Moore Capito, Republican from West Virginia, ranking member on the Environment and Public Works Committee, telling Fox News Digital, quote, "Democrats celebrate the one-year anniversary of their partisan climate and regulatory spending spree, But the reality is the results have been devastating for the American family. The IRA poured trillions of taxpayer dollars into unaccountable programs that have done little to actually reduce emissions. Americans should know that through this legislation, they've subsidized the Democrats' first iteration of the Green New Deal. All the while, they continue to pay sky-high prices to fill up their tanks and power their homes. The Inflation Reduction Act was named when it was passed in 2022. A Reuters article writes that it helped solve a political problem for Democrats who were concerned that voters would punish them for soaring prices in the 2022 congressional elections. A question about the name today to the president's domestic policy advisor, Neera Tanden, in the White House briefing room.
Does the White House intend to sell or say brand the legislation in a different way moving forward? Neera, you mentioned that the provisions are often very, very popular, but we did see the president himself acknowledge last week that it has less to do with reducing inflation than with providing alternative forms of economic growth. And so I'm wondering, on the messaging and branding side, are you all intending to pitch this in a different way to the public?
Well, I would say that the law itself is delivering benefits. In just a few weeks, we will have HHS announce the first 10 drugs that will be negotiated. I think we need to see, we will see results in the coming months and years. As pointed out in the legislation itself, there's a framework for lowering drug costs. Some this year, some next year, and for years to come. So we have always known that the benefits will be delivered over time, but benefits, people are experiencing these benefits now. So my focus is ensuring that people understand that they will have lower drug costs because of the Inflation Reduction Act, that those drug costs will be a real difference in their bottom lines. Drug costs are a high proportion of healthcare costs, and as I said, in the United States, Americans are paying more for drug costs than everywhere else. We see a real salience to this. So my focus is in really ensuring that we are implementing this and delivering those results to people.
Neera Tanden, White House Domestic Policy Advisor. In the White House briefing room, also there, John Podesta, an advisor to the president on clean energy. President Biden will be traveling to the Hawaiian island of Maui on Monday, writes the New York Times, to view the damage from raging wildfires that devastated much of a coastal town and killed more than 100 people. The White House announced on Wednesday. Mr. Biden had signaled a day earlier that he would visit as soon as we can, and the White House statement formalized the timing. Jill Biden, the First Lady, will accompany the president, who will meet with emergency workers, survivors, and federal and state and local officials. President Biden tweeting or writing on X, the social media platform formerly known as Twitter, "I remain committed to delivering everything the people of Hawaii need as they recover from this disaster." The FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell spoke with reporters in the White House briefing room today about the help being provided, including the search for more than 1,000 people who have yet to be found.
Now, it's important to remember that this is still a very active and dynamic situation, and our FEMA urban search and rescue teams are working closely with the state to help account for those who are still missing. Given the conditions and the need for additional resources, we will have at least 40 canine search teams on the island, in addition to hundreds of search and rescue personnel, with more on the way. We're working carefully to search the affected areas thoroughly and compassionately while respecting all of the cultural sensitivities. This is a really hard disaster, and this is a really difficult search operation. Because of the conditions and the fire debris, the dogs have to navigate the heat. They have to deal with issues with their paws, walking through glass and debris. And in these conditions, the dogs require frequent rest, which is why we are sending in additional dogs to augment the operation. In addition to them, 30 specialists from the HHS mortuary teams are already in Maui and will soon be joined by the mortuary specialists from the Department of Defense. These experts are going to be able to help identify loved ones. Now, I want to be honest with everyone. This is also going to be a very long and hard recovery. But our federal, state, and local partners are working around the clock to help all of those who have been impacted by this disaster. From the beginning of this event, my regional administrator has been on the ground and has been leaning forward to support those in need. As he always does, President Biden directed me to move quickly and push as many resources into the area so we could help people as soon as possible that were impacted.
FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell in the White House briefing room. The New York Times article saying that the experts who have been arriving in Maui this week to join the painstaking process of recovering and identifying more than 100 people who perished last week in the historic Hawaiian town of Lahaina include DNA specialists who have been working with Ukrainian investigators to document suspected Russian war crimes, veterans of the post-September 11th search at Ground Zero, and anthropologists who were enlisted to examine human remains after the California wildfire that until last week was America's deadliest in more than a century. Administrator Criswell said that FEMA has opened its first disaster recovery center on Maui to help victims of the wildfires. It's a place where people can get information about assistance from FEMA and other federal agencies.
I heard everything you said about all the resources that are being brought to bear, but we keep interviewing survivor after survivor who says that either they didn't see any government personnel or assistance for days, or that they still haven't. How do you explain the disconnect between what they're saying and what you're saying about all the resources that are there in Maui?
I think you need to understand that this community is going through an amazingly traumatic event. I can tell you that we have personnel that are on the ground year-round and embedded in with the state as soon as the fire started, so we could continue to understand what resources were needed and help move them in. The Coast Guard conducted 17 rescues that day and supported 40 additional rescues. And so they were there Tuesday helping these people escape the flames that they were experiencing. We have staff in the shelters. I met with many of the individuals. They're right there. Our staff are walking and talking to the people and helping them register for assistance. We also have our voluntary agencies like the United Way and the American Red Cross that are there. And we know that we need to get to everybody. There's also people that are staying with family and friends, staying with residents in other parts of the island, and that's why our teams will continue to go out into the communities to make sure everybody that needs assistance can get assistance. I think the Disaster Recovery Center is going to be one way that they have a place and a focal point that they can come get their questions answered instead of just going to a shelter, which is what's been available right now.
FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell in the White House briefing room. She was also asked about the planned visit next week by President Biden and the First Lady.
Yesterday we heard from the president who said he was hoping to visit soon. Obviously the announcement was made today, but he didn't want it to be disruptive. Can you talk specifically about what the president will see, who he'll meet with, and what efforts are being undertaken to make sure that his visit is not disrupting the ongoing efforts to support the local communities?
Yeah, I mean, as I have been briefing the president, I have been explaining to him the dynamics of the situation on the ground and the ability to make sure that we give the space to our search and rescue teams to continue to be able to account for everybody that is missing. I know when the president travels, he's going to be able to bring hope, and he's going to speak with the governor and the state's first lady and talk to survivors and hear their stories. And it's that level of hope that I think is going to really be a positive impact for this community.
FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell, as she came out to the White House briefing, she said that she had been briefing President Biden and that he had been speaking with Hawaii's Governor Josh Green. Josh Green was interviewed this morning on ABC's Good Morning America program about the recovery.
We are progressing with the recovery. 106 fatalities as of last night. 27% of the ground has been covered, although many of the fatalities were on the road down by the sea. So the numbers will increase, but they will not increase, we hope, to further catastrophic proportions. We just don't know yet. We have an enormous team on the ground, and we're forever grateful to the president and the full force of everyone who's helping. The president turned around our emergency declaration in 6 hours, which opened up all sorts of potentials for us to respond, of course. We have 185 rescue folks on the ground with 20 dogs going through houses. We've begun to house people, of course. We're moving from the initial phase of recovery deep into the acute phase. There's just so many things to share. What I can tell you is people are holding up. We have the National Guard on the ground. We opened the road last night so that people can get from east to west on Maui. We're just grateful for everyone's outpouring of support. And though the workload's extraordinary and our hearts are broken, we will get through it. We just are still kind of in the thick of doing recovery.
There's an awful lot of frustration, sadness, and heartbreak as well. When will people be able to get back and survey the damage at their homes?
As of last night, I gave the order to open the road. So the way that's going to work now is from 6 a.m. every morning until 10 p.m. people will be able to drive freely. We will have, of course, our National Guard response along the side of the road so that no one goes into the impact zone. The impact zone is, number one, still there with our loved ones, and so we have to be very careful not to disturb the scene so that we can do the necessary recovery. But people can get over there now, and then between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., it's only for people who are doing emergency drop-offs and for individuals that live there. That was important. We've had multiple trips into the scene and site with our professionals, of course. People like myself and our fire and police have been in there often. Like I said, I know it's frustrating for people, but this was a tragic combination of both a fire and a hurricane, which meant that, well, extremely high temperatures were traveling at 60 to 81 miles per hour, and it swept through, in some cases, melting metal and granite and engine blocks. That's how hot it was. So it's a very delicate scene. There are toxic metals and asbestos down there. Of course, we have the EPA and others already on the scene too. We're just being careful. But it's, as you know, always a combination of both recovery, heartache and devastation, and safety. All those things happen at once, and that's why sometimes people can be frustrated. But we appreciate everyone for their understanding of what we're going through.
Hawaiian Governor Josh Green on ABC's Good Morning America this morning. The White House says that the president has approved Hawaii's request for 100% reimbursement of the costs of the emergency work during this early stage of the recovery of the wildfires on Maui. Wall Street today, the Dow down 180, NASDAQ down 156, S&P down 33. Washington today continues in a moment.
When citizens are truly informed, our republic thrives. Get informed straight from the source on C-SPAN. Unfiltered, unbiased, word for word. From the nation's capital to wherever you are. Because the opinion that matters the most is your own. This is what democracy looks like. C-SPAN, powered by cable.
Welcome back to Washington Today, which you can get as a podcast on the C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you find your podcasts. A few more headlines. A federal appeals court has upheld parts of a decision limiting access to the widely used abortion pill, mifepristone. The Supreme Court, though, has already put a stay on the case while the appeals take place, so the pill is still widely available. Next stop for the case is the Supreme Court. The three-judge panel on the U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals held that the Food and Drug Administration failed to take into account safety concerns when it loosened access to the pill in 2016. Fulton County District Attorney Fani Willis is requesting a March 4, 2024 start date in the trial of former President Donald Trump and 18 co-defendants on the charges handed up this week in Atlanta, alleging they tried to overturn Donald Trump's loss in Georgia in the 2020 presidential election. Fani Willis also in court filings seeking arraignments the week of September 5th, and she says that does not conflict with Donald Trump's other criminal and civil matters pending in the courts. Story from NBC News. Mike Pence, who is running for the Republican presidential nomination, addressed former President Donald Trump's fourth indictment for the first time on Wednesday, speaking at the National Conference of State Legislatures Legislative Summit in Indianapolis. Mike Pence condemned Donald Trump's conduct amid his refusal to concede the 2020 election in the last days of the administration.
Now this week comes another indictment regarding the former president's conduct in the days leading up to the close of our administration. I've said many times I had hoped the judgment about those days would be left to the American people and to history. But such is not the case. But in these times, I want to say I think it's important that we hew to first principles and that we tell the truth to the American people. The first principles are these. No one is above the law. And the president and all those implicated are entitled to the presumption of innocence that every American enjoys. But secondly, despite what the former president and his allies have said for now more than 2.5 years, and continue to insist to this very hour, the Georgia election was not stolen, and I had no right to overturn the election on January 6th.
Mike Pence, former vice president and now Republican presidential candidate at the National Conference of State Legislatures Summit in Indianapolis, Indiana, which is Mike Pence's home state. He's a former governor and congressman from that state. During his speech, he was also encouraged to tell a story about when he met former Republican President George W. Bush at the White House, and it includes an impersonation of the former president.
He liked what I was talking about. And he looked at me at one point and he said, at the end of the meeting, he said, Mike, I just want you to be encouraged. And I said, thank you, Mr. President. He goes, I'd like you to see me as an encourager. I said, thanks. He said, I'd like you to leave here with some encouragement. And I said, Mr. President, you know, standing here in the Oval Office with the leader of the free world, I'm encouraged.
Mike Pence today in Indianapolis. He expects to be on the debate stage 1 week from today in Milwaukee with other Republican presidential candidates. The Republican National Committee has not said which candidates have met the qualification thresholds. That would be minimum number of donors and minimum performance in certain polls, but the Pence campaign says that he has qualified. Political science professors at American University today talked about how candidate Donald Trump's indictments will affect the presidential race and what to expect from the first Republican debate. You'll hear from David Barker, Amy Dacey, and Jordan Tama.
How should the other GOP candidates respond to former President Trump's strategy to win over primary voters? David Barker, what will you take this one? What advice would you give them?
Well, they're in a real catch-22, right? The same one that most Republicans have been in for the past 6 years. And the conventional wisdom that I hear in the media from some pundits seems to be that they should speak up more, that they should challenge him more, they should call him out more on these things. However, I completely understand why they're reluctant to do that. I mean, I think that, you know, given the profile of Trump and his support within the base and his overwhelming lead in the polls and all the oxygen he sucks up, I think that if you're one of those other candidates right now, your strategy has to be to hope that one of these indictments winds up turning into a conviction and he winds up, you know, being disqualified, and then you're there to pick up the slack. And if that's the case, right, if that's what you're hoping for, which I think they have to, then you don't want to be the person who alienated all of Trump's supporters. And so I think they're in a holding pattern. And I think that that's unfortunate for them. You know, they're going to be asked about this in the debate. It's going to be very difficult for them to not just look, you know, mealy-mouthed and wishy-washy. That's the sort of the position that they're in. Unfortunately, that may be the safest strategy for a little while longer.
And talking about that debate and what none of this will be settled by then, we're talking about next week. What do you expect from the upcoming debate, particularly if Donald Trump doesn't show up? First of all, will anybody watch it if he's not there? Amy Dacey, what do you think?
Yeah, I don't think Donald Trump has to show up. I think the conversation will be certainly around Donald Trump. There's already pressure from some of the, Republican candidates that the indictment should be talked about on that stage. I think what I'm looking for is and there might be a strategy with Trump not showing up to be, to debate the actual debate participation. But, a lot of these debates have become kind of a platform and an ability for some of these candidates to get a one-liner, to get into the press where they don't always have access, to do that. So for those that are participating, the ones that have qualified, and we've seen that there's still some trying to hit those barriers. And interestingly enough, one of the qualifications is you have to say that you will pledge to support the, actual nominee, which is an interesting part of it. I think the other thing is I'm looking to see what does Fox News Brett Baier and Mary McCollum care about, because those are the things, the questions they bring up, the topics they decide to discuss in this debate will be very interesting to me, as they think those are the things that are on the front minds of, people beyond the indictment conversation as well. I think that Trump, if he does not participate, it speaks a lot to, like, these are forums to actually talk about, why you're the best candidate to move forward. And if he chooses not to participate, what his influence will be in the room. And then in addition, what are these candidates going to try to accomplish? Is a Chris Christie going to try and accomplish by discrediting him? Is somebody else going to try and, out Trump on some of these issues that are so polarizing, but work well with the Republican base? And again, it's what does Fox want to talk about in that time frame?
David, I think I saw your hand.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Amy said. I also just wanted to mention that I agree that Chris Christie is definitely going to attack Trump. That's the lane that he's chosen, and that should make for some interesting fireworks. What I'm curious to see is whether any of the other candidates choose to actually respond to Christie by defending Trump. I could envision DeSantis actually trying to score points again with the base by taking that strategy, and that would be quite curious.
Jordan, Tama, this debate will be next week. There will be many candidates on the stage, some with rather low polling numbers, looking for that debate moment. In your opinion, who has the most to gain and the most to lose, Jordan?
Well, Trump should have the most to lose because he's by far the front runner. He's the only person who has a good distance downward to go. But I don't think the debate is going to affect his standing in the primary one way or the other, regardless of whether he participates. He will still be, far and away the front runner after the debate. So I think the debate's more likely to be consequential for the other candidates, both DeSantis, who currently is kind of in the second position, right? He is the second place person right now, according to all polls. And then the kind of large set of candidates that are all kind of grouped together in the third tier currently in the primary, around 2%, 3%, 4%, according to the polls regarding their standing in the Republican primary. For them, it's really about the possibility of a viral moment, which could be helpful or harmful. We've seen from debates in past election seasons that candidates sometimes have a moment in a debate that ends up disqualifying them because they look bad. We've also seen moments in past debates where candidates have said something that got a lot of attention for them in a positive way and gave them a huge boost. And so who that is totally open at this point, but that's what we're going to be wanting to look for from this debate. Who gets a moment that kind of shoots them upward or downward, and it's hard to say at this point who that might be.
David.
Real quickly, just look for somebody, and again, I would anticipate DeSantis being the most likely candidate to attack the moderators, to go after Baier and the media more generally.
David Barker, Congressional and Presidential Studies Director at American University, along with other university scholars, a virtual discussion about Donald Trump's presidential election campaign. You also heard from Jordan Tama, who is School of International Service Provost and Associate Professor, and Amy Dacey, Institute of Policy and Politics Executive Director. This is Washington Today. The State Department is responding to North Korea's confirmation that Army Private Travis King is in North Korea after he was seen crossing the DMZ separating North and South Korea in July. A statement from the state-run Korean Central News Agency says that Travis King had expressed his willingness to seek refuge in North Korea or a third country, and he had decided to enter North Korea as he harbored ill feeling against inhuman maltreatment and racial discrimination within the U.S. Army. Here is State Department Deputy Spokesperson Vedant Patel.
Can I just ask you if you have, and I don't expect that you do, but if you have anything new you can update us on the status of Private King in North Korea?
I have no updates. If you're referring to some of the comments that have been in public reporting overnight and this morning, what I can say is that we cannot verify the comments attributed to Private King. What I will say is, though, that we remain focused on his safe return, and our priority is to bring Private King home, and we are working through all available channels to achieve that outcome. And his well-being continues to be a top priority for us, as well as his safety.
And since this morning, there hasn't. Are you aware of any contact that there's been between?
There's not been.
Can I follow on that?
Sure.
You say that you remain focused on his safe return and pursuing all available channels. Can you be any more specific as to what those channels that you're sending these messages through actually are?
So these are sensitive diplomatic conversations, Kylie, so I'm not going to get into the specifics of them, but what I will just say, and you've heard us say this before, is that we retain a number of channels through which we're able to send messages and communicate to the DPRK. As is widely known, Sweden serves as the protecting power for the United States and the DPRK, and we're working in close contact with our Swedish counterparts on this. Regarding this case, but I'm just not going to get more specific or into the details beyond that.
And then just one more question. As the U.S. is, trying to engage North Korea on this, are you guys offering North Korea anything to partake in these engagements, or are you just saying that you really would like to have these conversations without any?
Right now, our top priority as it relates to Private King is the same that it has been for a number of weeks now, wanting to get assertion on his safety, on his well-being, and on his status, and that continues to be what we're trying to pursue.
Not in return for anything, right?
That is correct.
Vedant Patel is the State Department deputy spokesperson at a briefing today at the State Department in Washington. Travis King was due to fly back to Fort Bliss, Texas, and be discharged from the U.S. military after serving time in a South Korean prison for assault, but instead left the airport, joined a civil tour group, and, according to the U.S. Defense Department, willfully and without authorization crossed the border to North Korea last month. White House National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby previewed Friday's meeting between President Joe Biden, the Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol at Camp David, the U.S. presidential retreat in Maryland. It'll be the first time that foreign leaders have visited Camp David since 2015 and the first standalone summit among these three countries, not held on the margins of another international meeting. John Kirby was asked during his briefing today about the issue of China, whether it's on the agenda.
David Smith of The Guardian, will threats to Taiwan from China be on the agenda in this meeting? And I wonder more generally, just as in your security assessment of, if the worst happened and Taiwan was invaded by China, what do you assess? Do you think the people of Taiwan, how would they respond? Do you get a sense they would fight, or is the willpower not there? And people say, well, perhaps the Chinese have infiltrated Taiwanese military to an extent, and so on.
Our goal, President Biden's goal, is to make sure that that day doesn't come. Nobody wants to see a conflict over Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait, and there's no reason for it to come to that. Quite frankly, there's been no change to American policy when it comes to the One China policy. We don't support independence for Taiwan, and we've said time and time and time again that we don't want to see the status quo changed in a unilateral fashion, and we certainly don't want to see it changed by force. So President Biden's whole approach here to the relationship with the PRC and to our relationships in the region, and as I said in my opening statement, we really focused a lot on restoring and reinvigorating alliances and partnerships, is to deter conflict, to not see that happen. And then as for what's on the agenda, I don't want to get ahead of the discussions too much detail here today, except to say that this trilateral summit is all about taking affirmative steps towards improving our cooperation with each other in a three-way sort of situation, and looking for. And you're going to see this when you see the initiatives that are announced on Friday. It's really about moving our relationships with each other and amongst each other to a whole new level. And so there'll be a range of topics discussed, everything from economics to diplomacy to certainly the security realm. But it is not about the PRC. It's not about a specific challenge in the region. It is really about the broader challenge of improving our trilateral cooperation. And I think it's important to remember how far Japan and the Republic of Korea have come together. through the leadership. I'm not. It's not overstating it, as in my opening statement, to talk about the political courage of President Yoon and Prime Minister Kishida to really advance their own bilateral relations. It's significant, and obviously we're happy to see that happen. But we also think there's room for growth, particularly in a trilateral format, and that's really what this is all about.
John Kirby, Strategic Communications Coordinator for the White House National Security Council, today at the Washington Foreign Press Center. The White House says that the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, will be meeting with reporters at the White House on Friday ahead of the summit at Camp David. John Kirby also asked today about the war in Ukraine and reports about discussions over Ukraine possibly relinquishing land for the time being in exchange for membership in the NATO military alliance.
From a very reliable source, I heard that it's an idea discussed in the White House that Ukraine may become the NATO member just in the borders, which will be liberated at that exact moment. And after that, Ukraine will start to struggle for the rest of the territory diplomatically, but not militarily. I appreciate the position of the administration that it's up to Ukraine how to end this war. But do you think the administration might support the idea to take the part of Ukraine, just to have a security guarantee, to end the war, and just to struggle for the rest of the territory later?
If you're asking that, you've heard there's an understanding that we give Ukraine NATO membership in exchange for ending the war.
The idea is, and I will give you the source later, that Ukraine might become the NATO members, the borders, which will be of the territory, which will be liberated for that moment, and the territory which will not.
The Russian occupied territory would be excluded from that. Yeah, there's nothing to that. That's not accurate. We've already talked about trying to help find a path towards membership. We've said publicly that NATO is going to be in Ukraine's future, and we at the Vilnius summit, the alliance stood behind that idea and got behind a notion wherein a pathway can be developed for that eventual membership. But the focus right now has got to be on helping Ukraine beat back Russian aggression and continue to claw back territory that rightfully belongs to them. And they are. They are making progress every day. Even they've said it's not going as fast as they would like, but they are making progress, and we're going to continue to support them. You just saw, another announcement of security assistance from the United States just this week. So that's what our focus is on.
John Kirby, Strategic Communications Coordinator for the White House National Security Council, with reporters today at the Washington Foreign Press Center. A NATO official, Stian Jensen, is telling the Norwegian newspaper VG that his remarks on the subject you just heard were a mistake. Yesterday, he was quoted as saying, "I think that a solution could be for Ukraine to give up territory and get NATO membership in return." That led to Ukrainian presidential advisor calling that ridiculous. Today, Stian Jensen telling that newspaper VG, "My statement about this was part of a larger discussion about possible future scenarios with Ukraine, and I shouldn't have said it that way. It was a mistake." Thanks for listening to Washington Today, Center for C-SPAN's evening newsletter, word for word, and you'll get the stories being talked about in Washington emailed to you every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.